Before I begin on the topic of is belief in God relevant in an age of science and technology, I thought I will tell you a scientific story. A story is told of Einstein. Einstein had just discovered and worked on his new formula, a new theory. And so Einstein was traveling all across the different universities, giving his lecture on this newfound theory of his. And after doing this for a couple of time, he was going along with this man who was driving him from one university to the other. So as he was coming towards the last leg of his lectures, he found himself having this problem of his throat. And so he was complaining and he was taking care of it, and so he was telling his driver that how he finds it difficult to deliver the last lecture. The driver looked at him and said, "Sir, I have been traveling with you. I have been hearing you for the past 1 month, you speaking on this same theory from one university to the other. I think I know word to word your every lecture. So if you don't mind, in this next university, I might as well speak." Einstein found himself in this very interesting situation, and considering the fact that his throat was very infected, and so he said, "Okay, let's get into that." And so he pretended to be the driver, and he drove the vehicle, and when he reached the university, the driver pretended to be Einstein. And so Einstein, there he was introduced. There were professors, there were eminent people from academic background, and so this driver delivered the talk flawlessly, just exactly like how Einstein has been delivering from one university to the other. And then the time of Q&A came. One professor stood up and thanked him for the talk. And then he asked his question, which was a very technical question. And this driver looked at this man and he said to him, "I thought you would ask a very difficult question, but your question is very easy, and that question can be handled by my driver." So I feel this evening with many of you, hearing some of you and what you do, I feel similarly like that driver. But I am thankful that I have my colleague as well here, Charles, who will also help in answering the difficult question. So I will give my talk that is comparatively easy, and then I will leave the hard part to Charles to handle it. Well, the topic for today is in fact a very broad one to begin with. And given the fact that it is very broad, and I also understand that many of you probably may not come from a scientific background, but in fact today, this is a huge challenge when it comes to the very belief of God. And in fact, there has been a lot of work that has been done in this area, the interface between science and religion. And so there are many thoughts that have been put forward by different people. And so for me this evening, I thought, considering the fact of this mixed audience, and I see some young people also here, and not to just leave you out as well, I will try to probably simplify it and avoid the technical one. And the reason why I'm telling this well in advance is so that if there is anyone who is very highly technical, will not accuse me for the simplistic approach that I am taking. But I have my reasons for doing what I'm doing. And hopefully during the Q&A, some of those questions will definitely come to the forefront. Now, when you speak of the relevance of the belief in God in an age of science, one important fact also comes to us from a historical perspective. A story is told of the time when the mathematician Laplace actually came up with his new textbook on mathematics. And it seems that tradition has this to say, and that Laplace had gone to actually give this new book to Napoleon. And Napoleon was not very much well versed with mathematics. And it seems that somebody whispered to Napoleon during the time, I believe it was probably like a book review or something like that. It was customary that they present it to Napoleon. And so someone whispered to Napoleon and said, why don't you ask him the question that in this very book that he's written on mathematics, where is God in this equation? Where is God in his equation? And the one who whispered this question knew, because there was no issue or there was no mention of the word God in this whole textbook. Laplace actually looked at Napoleon and said and responded, famously known, that I have no need for that hypothesis. I have no need for that hypothesis. Everyone hearing the response that he gave came back with the belief or with the notion that Laplace has actually come to a conclusion that in this entire understanding of mathematics and all, and he's come to a conclusion that there is no need for God. And so word has spread till the point that Laplace, as he spent his last days on his deathbed, told his friend to actually clarify this very confusion. You see, the whole idea and the whole question is this, that Laplace was right in a sense that when in his equation with regard to mathematics, you don't necessarily have to go out of the way and to always insert and bring God when it is not necessary. But then the point that he clarified through his friend is this, that if the question was to probably be rephrased and asked that in the context of this universe as a whole, where do you think God will fit in? Then he says that the question of God would be very, very relevant. I normally used to speak to students, especially in university context, and I have always, when speaking on this topic, have mentioned this, that when you come and study in a university studies is important because it adds a lot of value. It helps you find a job for yourself. But the studies that you do in the university may not be so relevant for you to find a life partner, or probably it may not be relevant to help you run your finances, because it has its speciality, it has its focus on a particular subject. And so the question again today for us, when we look at the very title itself, is the belief in God relevant? It is, we should probably add another subheading to it, is with reference to what? With reference to what? And that would probably be the area in which we would actually look upon. Now, I believe that when we try to attempt and to dive into this very subject, there are basically 4 important ideas that I want to throw and to probably lay before each of us to consider. 2 of these ideas are scientifically based, and 2 of these ideas are actually philosophically based. So 4 important ideas, 2 of them are scientific and 2 of them are philosophical. And you will probably understand that when we are looking at this whole issue of relevance, it is important that we take a broad perspective rather than to narrow it down with just a scientific approach as well. The first and the foremost important scientific fact or scientific reason that I want to place before us when we consider this very topic of the relevance of God in the midst of science and technology is the entire area of what people call as the cosmological. The cosmological. Now that's a big word. But what it basically means is the cosmos as a whole, the universe as a whole. Now when you really look at this whole aspect of the cosmos, one important scientific fact is there that is called as the law of causality. The law of causality deals with this whole aspect of cause and effect. If there is an effect, there must always be a cause. If suppose now I tell you, if we were to clap, That would be the effect. But then the cause of that sound that comes out of our clapping is because of there is a cause, and we are the one who's clapping. Now science, in fact, is solidly based on this very one foundation. And that is very interesting to know, that this very foundation of the law of causality, on which science actually sits upon, is not scientifically proven, but it is an assumption that it begins with. It is an assumption. And then, furthermore, if you really look at the cosmos as a whole, in light of cause and effect, or in light of the law of causality, today, it is a scientifically established fact that this universe of ours actually did have a beginning. Now, for so many centuries, beginning with Aristotle has made this whole idea popular that this universe is actually eternal. It does not have a beginning and it does not have an end. But you know, it is only in the 20th century that because of the new scientific discoveries that have been made, that very notion of this universe being eternal has been debunked. And that today, we know for a fact that this universe did have a beginning. It did have a beginning. Now, I want you to understand that if any entity has a beginning, that it definitely does need and require, or it demands a cause. Now, there are different philosophical arguments that can be given. But let me borrow from one famous philosopher by the name of William Lane Craig. He has simplified some of the very sophisticated arguments, and it is very easy, and he has put it in a very philosophical argument, and it goes in this way. Now let's say in any philosophical argument, a little class and a little lesson on an argument. What is an argument? From a philosophical point of view, an argument actually has a minimum of two main points, and then it has the third point, which is the conclusion. Okay, the first one and the second one, it comprises an argument, and then the third one is a conclusion. And in this very philosophical argument that William Lane Craig actually puts forward, he says like this, with regard to the universe having a beginning, he says, anything that has a beginning needs a cause. Anything that has a beginning needs a cause. Secondly, this universe, this cosmos, did have a beginning. This cosmos did have a beginning. Conclusion, therefore, this cosmos needs a cause. This cosmos needs a cause. Are you able to follow that basic brief argument? Now, what then is the reason behind the scientists actually finding this whole approach and this whole argument that the universe did have a beginning? There are some very important aspects to this. Now, if you really see, there is one important fact that we all grapple. I remember as a child, I have also grappled on this issue. I remember asking my dad, my dad is a medical doctor. And when I was young, when I was small, I used to actually love traveling with him when he goes and treats patients. During those days, it was not so much of people going to the hospital, but there are more of home visits that doctors used to actually pay. And so my dad did that. And I, as a young boy, used to actually walk with my dad with the, blood pressure apparatus and then the stethoscope, and we used to walk together. And one fine day, I remember asking my dad as we were walking, I said, "Dad," I said, "how did I come into existence? Who made me?" And I was young, and my dad is a medical doctor, and so I may not be able to understand all, but he tried his best to actually give me an explanation. And this is how he gave. He said, "See, son, I fell in love with your mom. And as I fell in love with your mom, and then we got together, we got married, and you are a product of that." And curious as I was, then I pushed the argument a little bit further. I said, "Okay, fine, I get that. But how did you come into existence?" And then he went on and he said the same story. He said, "You see, your grandfather and your grandmother, they also fell in love and they got married, and that is how your mother was born in a different place, I was born in a different place." And then I pushed the argument a little bit further. I said, "Then who actually caused and brought them into existence?" And at that point of time, my father was fed up with all my questions. He says, "You asked too many questions, now shut up and keep walking." But then I realized that as I grew in my life, that question never went away. I went on to do science in my life, and I went on to actually study. And in fact, I spent my time in trying to understand that, and that is why I went on to do philosophy and religion, and then later on science and religion. Purely because as a child, I have the question, but then when you grow up, it becomes far more sophisticated. But then the question nevertheless still boils down to the important fact that now if you and I talk about the universe and the need for it to have a cause, the same question might also apply. If God is the one who created the universe, then who created God? Have you ever wondered? That question would be very, very relevant. But then the way of answering that question is very simple. It is this. Now, if God is God, then he has to be by necessity someone who's infinite. No beginning, no end. He's not bound by time. He's not restricted and not limited in any way. And then by nature of how the cosmos actually exists, it is a very finite entity. And philosophers actually talk about this as the universe is contingent. That means the universe, the reason for its existence, it is dependent. Just as much as I am dependent for my existence on my parents. And my parents are dependent, they are contingent again on their parents as well. So this nature of existence of the universe is a contingent one. That means it depends. But then you cannot project the same finite necessity for the reason of existence of a finite entity and then project the same to God. Because then it ends up with only this, that God is an uncaused being. God is an uncaused being. Now, having said that, let me come back to the scientific explanation. How did they come in the first place to this whole idea of the universe having its beginning? There are a few important scientific facts that we need to actually consider. You know, a few years ago, that is in the month of April 24, 1992, a man by the name of Dr. Edwin Hubble. I'm sure many of you, especially young people, would be familiar with this Hubble Space Telescope. Yeah, it is one of the massive telescopes that anyone have made thus far, and it's able to capture certain important images way in a distance. And this telescope, in fact, through the help of what they call as the Cosmic Background Explorer satellite that was launched, they were able to actually take photographs that they detected what today they call as the cosmic microwave background radiation. Cosmic microwave background radiation. Now, they were able to detect that. Now, what does that data tell us? The data basically tells us this, that now that is actually a reflection of an explosion that took place long time ago, billions of years ago. And that is what today we know popularly as the Big Bang. The Big Bang was the explosion, and now centuries after, these telescopes have captured the very images of these microwave radiation. So now people are talking about that this is a very important finding. This new discovery actually tells us that, that the universe did begin with the Big Bang. So there was a beginning. Now all of you must have heard of a man by the name of Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking actually is another genius after Einstein. And Stephen Hawking actually in his book, A Brief History of Time, made a very important observation with regard to this beginning that I was talking about. And may I read it to you? And he says, it would be very difficult to explain. It would be very difficult to explain why the universe should have begun in just this way, except as the act of a God who intended to create beings like us. This is Stephen Hawking saying. And as far as I understand that, formally, Stephen Hawking is not a follower of Christ, neither a believer. But then even he as a scientist understands the inescapability of this question itself, that this universe definitely needs a reason for its very own existence. And that is what it is important for us to consider. And this very finding, in fact, there is another finding, the latest new discovery that was made was in the year 2014. Few scientists in the Antarctica region, they spotted out what they call as the smoking gun. The smoking gun is actually, again, the gravitational radiation that comes as a result of what we have continued with the Big Bang. So there are two important scientific findings that affirms the beginning of the universe. And with these two findings, there was a huge turn in the entire study in the field of cosmology. It's shaken, it was a revolution as it is. Now that brings us back to the scripture. The scripture in Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And mind you, this was written by Moses thousands of years ago, even before people like Aristotle came to the picture or to the scene. And so now, for us, even when we look at the discoveries and the different findings, we can't avoid but go back to what the scriptures actually say. So it affirms the very belief, the very explanation that the Bible basically gives. So that is the first important scientific aspect. Now the second important one is what scholars basically talk about. It is called as simply design. The technical word for that is teleology. Teleology, that means it is the telos. It is actually the Latin meaning, for design, for purpose. Now, in the universe as a whole, if you really look at the nature of this universe, it has within itself this whole aspect of design and purpose. It almost seems as if there has been packed within it this entire issue of purpose. It was designed for life to thrive and to flourish. It was designed. No other planet, especially that is known today, is feasible or viable for life to exist. In fact, few planets, actually I forget again the planet, but they were able to detect some source of water, because if there is water, there is a possibility for life to exist. So scholars are still working on that. But you know, when you really look at this planet Earth, this is the only planet that is actually having within it the whole dynamics and the whole furniture within it that makes life possible, that gives scope for life to exist. And that is something that scholars have actually been talking about. Now, when you look at the universe, when you look at our planet is part of the solar system. The solar system is part of a galaxy that is called as the Milky Way galaxy. Now, we also know that there are many other galaxies, right? And then if you really look at just our Milky Way galaxy, forget about the other galaxies, just our Milky Way galaxy. And within this galaxy, there is this solar system where these heavenly bodies of ours, such as the moon, the sun, and all the other planets that are there, they actually revolve around each other and so on and so forth. And you know the dynamics of that. You know the explanation. But the whole point is this, that if you really look at our galaxy itself, some scholar actually say that if you were to count all the stars that actually are there in the Milky Way galaxy, if you count one star at the rate of 1 second, you would probably have to be here on planet Earth for 2,500 years to just be able to count the approximate aspect of the number of stars that are there in Milky Way galaxy, not the other galaxy. And it fascinates to actually read the scriptures that God has made all the heavenly bodies, and then He's put the stars also in its own place. Magnificent, isn't it? Magnificent. So now when you really look at this whole aspect of design, you can't help but think that there are some aspect of design or fine-tuning. It is just like a watch that has been finely tuned. That is the whole aspect. You know, a couple of years ago, there are two important scientific journalists who have actually written a book, and the book title is Cosmic Coincidences. And in this Cosmic Coincidences, he has listed 4 important forces that actually governs this, that makes the whole universe stay where it is. And these 4 important forces are, number 1, it is the gravitational force. Secondly, it is the electromagnetic force. Thirdly, it is the strong nuclear force. And fourthly, it is the weak nuclear force. Gravitational force, electromagnetic force, strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force. All of these four forces are the one that has been observed to actually make the universe tick, to make the universe stay where it is. Why doesn't the planet actually flow in one direction and fly in this direction? But it is these forces. In fact, it is the law of gravity that makes us also sit uptight, right? Otherwise, all of us would be floating in mid-air, and then, it's the gravity. So, thanks to the law of gravity. All of these four important forces are so significant. The reason is, scientists actually say that if the forces of gravity were to even, and between these four important forces, even if they were to increase a little bit more, then life would be actually difficult to exist here. And if it were to be narrower, then the balances or the constants within it would actually again make life difficult to be possible here on planet Earth. So basically telling us that everything is just so neatly and finely tuned just to make it possible for life to exist. It's almost like someone holding an arrow in their hand and a bow and releasing it. That arrow is going thousands of miles away and still hitting it bullseye. That's the kind of aim, that's the kind of fine-tuning that we are talking about. But when you look at design, design is not only in the macrocosm of this universe. You look within the microcosm of your existence and my existence, your body and my body. Your body and my body basically have what we actually say it's the cell. The cell, if you really look into a cell is actually a magnificent thing to actually hold and to see. Let me just read one particular write-up from a man by the name of Dr. Michael Denton. He wrote this book that is called as Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. And he had something to write that is fascinating. I'll just quote it and then probably I'll explain. To grasp the reality of life as it has been revealed by molecular biology, we must magnify a cell 1,000 million times until it is 20 kilometers in diameter, and it resembles a giant airship, large enough to cover a great city like London or New York. What we would then see would be an object of unparalleled complexity, adaptive design. On the surface of the cell, we would see millions of openings, like the portholes of a vast spaceship, opening and closing to allow a stream of material, that means nutrients, to follow in and out. If we were to enter one of these openings, we would find ourselves in a world of supreme technology and bewildering complexity. End of quote. The cell, I'm just talking about the cell. I've not yet touched upon the DNA and the kind of information that is back. You and I know that if you read a novel, you will not come back and say probably this was a product of an explosion that has taken place in a printing press. You definitely know that there is an author behind a story that is there. And when you see something that is so finely tuned, the information that is packed in a DNA, it cannot have come into existence without the input of an intelligent being behind it. Because if there is design, there must be a designer. If there is sophisticated machine such as a watch, there must be a watchmaker. That is the whole understanding that we need to keep in mind. It is sad, on the other hand, that very often we ignore this fact. I'm sure that you must have heard a man by the name of Francis Collin, Dr. Francis Collin. He was the director during the regime of Bill Clinton. He was the director of the Human Genome Project. And Francis Collin, in fact, being involved in this project, later on at the end of it, became from atheist to theist, believing in God. And this is what he basically had to say. It is humbling for me, he says, and awe-inspiring to realize that we have caught the first glimpse of our own instruction book previously known only to God. That is Francis Collin basically saying. Francis Collin, after working and seeing the amount of work, in fact, he's a brilliant man. The project was for 5 years, but then before time they had actually wrapped up the whole project. And that has actually brought a revolution even in treating of medicine in so many ways, because once you know the genetic code, and it helps us even in detecting and diagnosing and even the treatment of any particular disease. So here you find that there is so much of design. There is so much of design. And today, in fact, long time ago, there was this movie. I don't know how many of you have seen Contact. Carl Sagan was involved and was part of one particular project. And that project was basically to kind of investigate and see if there is any intelligent life outside of this planet. Any alien life, if at all there is there. And Carl Sagan spent the rest of his life in just trying to actually look upwards. Just to probably, and the way that they did was basically between the odd numbers and the even numbers. And that was the whole thing. But anyway, leaving that aside, the whole issue for us is this. They have actually gone and looked outside for intelligent existence for the reason of probably the possibility of life elsewhere. But they have ignored to see the intelligence that is packed within this very system itself. Yeah? And that is why on the sideline of that, we have been able to put a man on the moon to walk on it. But the sad thing is, until today, we have not been able to walk uprightly and righteously right here on earth. Isn't it fascinating that when we talk so much about science, science can do this, science can do that. But then, science can only explain the what of this universe, but the science cannot explain the why of this universe. So the first important thing is the cosmology. The second important thing is the teleology. And very quickly, we go into the philosophical aspect. And the first important one is the rationality. That is reason. You see, very often when you look into this aspect, we all know that you and I, from a Christian perspective, the Bible tells us that we have been created in the image of God. And part of that image basically involves the very idea of rationality. If God is intelligent, so are we. If God is rational, so are we. But the only difference I very often put is this. God is intelligent with capital I and we are intelligent with small letter I. So we should not get confused between the two. So when you look at reason, when you look at intellect, intellect basically has its basis. You cannot say actually, where did this reason come from, but it has come from nowhere. No, you can't say that. You know, C.S. Lewis once said that, if you sit and reason with me, and if you basically tell me that the reason for this particular thing is this reason, and I will continue to hear you, he says. Give me reason after reason, I will continue to hear you. But the moment that you make the transition from a reason to a non-reason, that is the time when I will tell you, stop. Because reason cannot come from non-reason. Just as much as life cannot come from non-life. And it is very important that we also keep in mind that the very foundation of reason itself lies on someone who is intelligent. Now, coming back a little bit on the scientific aspect of this very issue itself of rationality. So much has been spoken today in the scientific world about evolution. The whole thrust of evolution, which is very much the explanation of probably how every species has come into existence and so on and so forth. And the whole issue at the very crux of evolution is this. How can you probably justify that life can come from non-life? And to make even things worse, how can intelligence and reason come from non-reason? That is at the heart of what is the problem regarding evolution as a theory in itself. I like what John Lennox basically used to tell. John Lennox, who's a professor in mathematics in Oxford, he used to tell this story of Aunt Matilda. I don't know how many of you have heard. Aunt Matilda, he gives this example. He says, let's say Aunt Matilda, because she loves John Lennox so much, and on his birthday, she bakes a beautiful cake for him to enjoy with his friends. And so Aunt Matilda brings this cake to the table and for John Lennox to celebrate. But then what happened is, John Lennox says, let's say that if all the smart scientists were to be brought from all over the world, all of them will be able to actually detect and analyze the nutrient content that is packed in this cake, right? In this cake that Aunt Matilda has made. But then he says, but nobody No smart people from anywhere will be able to actually say as to why this cake was made in the first place. And so John Lennox basically asks, and he says, who then is the right person to tell the purpose of why this cake was baked in the first place? Who do you think is the right person? Aunt Matilda, right? Aunt Matilda is the right person. Similarly, today when we really look at the whole aspect of science, you and I today are able to explain the mechanism that works behind a clock or a watch. We may be able to explain, but that does not mean that we necessarily have to do away with the watchmaker. The watchmaker may not be in the watch. You will not find the watchmaker in the watch. But then you cannot even make sense of the purpose of why the watch was made without the watchmaker. Understanding the mechanism from a scientific point is one aspect, and understanding the very purpose of why it was made is another important aspect. So I think the third important thing for us is rationality. Rationality has its basis. Finally, we come to the fourth important aspect, and that is called morality. Morality basically says it deals with the whole area of right and wrong, the whole framework of moral values. And so if you look at morality and this whole entire idea of behavior, many atheists actually acknowledge that there is a moral value, but they do not necessarily come to a conclusion that there is a God who is the reason behind moral values. Now, I remember when I was a student in my final year in the university, I had this conversation with my friend. He was highly intelligent, very, very intelligent. But he is one of those people who is very much deeply immersed in science. And he does not believe in God, and he thinks it's all nonsense. And so one day we were talking, and I gave him this whole aspect. I said, what then do you make of morality? The whole idea of right and wrong and so on and so forth. He quickly responded by saying, oh, well, basically it's all instinct. It's all instinct. Well, we are veterinarians, and so we deal with animals. How do you think animals survive? It's all basically self-preservation. Self-preservation is the driving force for this, and instinct. Wow, I thought for some time, and then I came back with another question, and then I said to him, what about another desire that we find within ourselves to help someone? And then he again smartly and brilliantly came up with a counterpoint, and he says, well, very easy. Look at the animal world. The animal world, a mother will always actually go out of the way in preserving its own offspring. Wow, I thought, that is amazing. And then somehow I feel as if God is again enabling me to actually ask him this question. I said, what about then that desire that we all have sometimes? A desire, a good desire and a bad desire. Sometimes if we have a desire, there is one desire in us that, suppress this one and encourage the other one. So there seems to be some ability in us that is beyond the animals to make some decision. And then I also added as a footnote, and I said to him, I think if you really look at that aspect, I may buy it, but the problem is this. A mother may always love its offspring, but will the same mother go out of the way in saving other mothers' offspring? That is the very heartpin of this whole struggle. You see, when you look at the universe as a whole, the universe as a whole has what we call as the descriptive law. The laws that I've just mentioned to you, the physical laws, such as the law of gravity. Now, nobody can dispute with that, right? Nobody can dispute with that. But then it's interesting that atheists normally will challenge us, and they will talk about this aspect, which we had dealt the other day. If God exists, then God ought not to have allowed evil and suffering to actually exist in this world. Ought not. And this oughtness talks about what we talk about, it's prescriptive. It's a prescription that a doctor would give. Now, just because a doctor writes a prescription, that does not mean that, we take the medicine very seriously. Now, the descriptive law, nobody will have any dispute. If you have any dispute with the law of gravity, you can simply actually test it by jumping from a building and see whether you have few broken bones or not. So now, but when it comes to the prescriptive law, you and I have the option to probably do it and not do it. But very often we do not talk about the brokenness of a person who rejects the prescriptive law. When you don't take the prescription given by the doctor, you do it at the risk of your own life. A prescription, that language of oughtness is definitely something that is very much there. So oughtness is something that is closely associated with morality and moral law. Now I'll give you a story. A story is told of this man who was basically a criminal. There were two brothers. Both of them were part of this gang. And all their life they've been like, doing all gang activities, criminal activities, and so on and so forth. And so one fine day, one of the brother actually lost his life in a gang fight. And so because this elder brother loved his younger brother so much, and so he had a lot of money, and so he thought that, the best, love that I can express is the last rites for him. And so he went to a priest, and he asked the priest to actually come and conduct the funeral. And so he asked the priest, he said, "Priest, I just want you to actually do me just one favor, and I will give you any amount of money that you want, but I just want you to do one thing for me. Now, during the time when you give the eulogy, of my younger brother, kindly tell one thing, that he's a good man. That he's a good man." And so the pastor, I believe, who was a businessman, and he said, "You are willing to give me any money, any amount of money, if I say that it's a good man, that he's a good man?" "Oh yes, any amount of money." So the time came for the funeral. The body was laid in the coffin, and then everybody have gathered, friends, relatives. The pastor came and said, "The man who's lying here in the coffin, he's a murderer, he is a thief, he's a rapist, he's done every conceivable thing that you probably cannot even think, but he has done it. But compared to his brother, he's a good man." You see, when you look at the moral law basically is based on a framework. It is based on a particular framework on which everything is actually evaluated as to what is right and what is wrong. And that is very important. And this moral law again go back to what we actually talk about, the moral law giver, that is God himself. And so morality also is another important plank or another important point. So we've looked at cosmology, we've looked at teleology, that is design, cosmology, cause and effect, rationality, there is a basis for our reasoning and our ability to reason well. And then thirdly and finally, we have also looked at morality, the basis for evaluating between right and wrong. So based on all of these important aspects, the question is worth revisiting. Is God relevant in an age of science and technology? I believe that with all of this that we've spoken, I think it is only valid to probably say that we need God in the equation. For without God, there is no way for us to justify the meaning and the purpose of our existence here. C.S. Lewis said this very important comment, and may I quote it. He said, "Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. Men became scientists and scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believe in a legislator." Let me bring this talk to a conclusion. That is why I think, in light of this, the option that is given to us is ultimately only two. One, God exists when you look at the universe. The other option is God does not exist. So basically the option is between atheism, no God, and theism, yes, God exists. That is the only two options. But I think for us to actually believe in all that we see in our world, it takes more faith. It takes less faith, in fact, to believe in God, but it takes more faith in not believing in God. And that is why I normally remind my atheist friends that you guys are far more, actually your faith is far more stronger than mine. Because in light of all of these evidence that is being brought to the table, and yet you still actually deny the very existence of God. And that is why I feel that we need to actually say to those people who believes that science is a means and an end in itself, or who actually believe so much on science, so much that they have made it as a kind of a religion in itself, we need to actually remind them that all things in life, when we go to the university, I started with the very idea of university. In fact, when you go to the university, it's not so much that we go there only to learn. But in fact, at the back of it, we go to the university because we want to know the truth. It is the pursuit of truth that we want to know. And in a university, rightly so, you will have different departments. You have science department, you have life sciences, you have non-science department as well, right? And no wonder university is called as unity in the midst of diversity. Unity in the midst of diversity. So I think if you and I are to actually look at this whole topic again, is belief in God relevant in an age of science and technology? We need to actually look at the whole aspect of truth. It is the pursuit of truth. Truth cannot be learned only from one particular objective, only from science. You need other disciplines as well. You need all the other disciplines in order to help you and me to come and to arrive at the conclusion of the pursuit of truth. And the truth is, God exists, and He is the very reason that is behind the creation and the existence of this universe as a whole.